February 19th, 1945. It was a dawn painted in smoke and foreboding. The air above the 8-square-mile kidney bean of volcanic ash called Iwo Jima carried the metallic tang of high explosives, a residue of the most sustained naval bombardment the Pacific had ever witnessed. For a grinding 72 hours, a vast armada, encompassing battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, a fleet concentration of over 500 ships, had poured fire onto the Japanese-held island. The mission of this staggering display of power was simple: to scour the Japanese from the face of the earth, to turn the island into nothing more than a pulverized staging ground for American aircraft. In the landing craft, churning toward the black, jagged shore, the 70,000 men of the U.S.V. Amphibious Corps, primarily drawn from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, watched the final curtain of fire lift. There was a desperate, almost superstitious hope that the noise and fury had succeeded, that the silence that followed would be the silence of victory. They were veterans of the island-hopping campaign, men who knew the drill: the Japanese defend the beaches with maniacal ferocity, and the first waves pay the highest price. But Iwo Jima, they were told, would be different. This target was too important, too thoroughly saturated with steel. The island's strategic value was crystalline. It lay almost perfectly equidistant between the American B-29 superfortress bases on Guam and the Japanese mainland. Tokyo, its two airfields, were not merely objectives, they were the indispensable sanctuaries required to save thousands of American airmen flying the long, treacherous route to and from Japan. The objective, Operation Detachment, was a surgical strike designed to secure this aerial lifeline. As the first Amtraks and landing craft scraped against the shore at 9:00 a strange, unsettling quiet descended. The Marines spilled out onto the volcanic beach, bracing for the inevitable. But the fire never came. There was no whistling lead, no scream of mortars, no banzai charge. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of sulfur and cordite, but silent. A cautious, bewildered relief spread across the narrow strip of sand. For an agonizing hour, men and vital equipment bulldozers, medical supplies, half-tracks poured ashore, creating an immediate, choking congestion. The Marines pushed forward, seeking cover, advancing on the initial low terraces that led toward the imposing, silent bulk of Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano that dominated the island's southern tip. This easy landing was the first fatal moment of the siege. The Marines had not been victorious. They had been granted a lethal courtesy, an invitation into a perfectly calibrated trap. The architect of this terrifying deception was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was a commander of brutal realism and strategic genius, having discarded the antiquated, costly Japanese military doctrine that insisted on fighting the enemy at the water's edge. Kuribayashi recognized that to face the American naval gunnery head-on was mass suicide. His objective was not to hold the beach, but to maximize the pain inflicted upon the invaders, forcing them to fight a war of attrition where American material superiority would be rendered useless. For nearly a year, Kuribayashi had supervised the creation of the Pacific War's greatest underground fortress. The soft, porous nature of the volcanic rock was his primary asset. His troops, over 20,000 strong, carved over 11 miles of intricate, interlinked tunnels and communication trenches, connecting more than 9,500 subterranean bunkers and pillboxes. These defenses were buried deep, protected by feet of reinforced concrete and rock, ensuring that the 3-day naval bombardment was utterly futile, while the American shells scoured the surface, pulverized the airfields, and rearranged the topography. Kuribayashi's army remained safely intact, hidden deep within the earth, waiting. The defense was designed to be mutually supporting. Every major defense point was connected to others, allowing troops to retreat from one blasted pillbox through a tunnel and emerge hours later to fire from a position previously thought to be cleared. Crucially, Kuribayashi insisted that heavy artillery and mortars be housed in hidden subterranean garages to be rolled out, fired, and withdrawn quickly before American spotters could accurately pinpoint their locations. The Marines, however, were undone not only by the invisible enemy, but by the very ground itself. The beaches were not composed of stabilizing sand, but fine-grained black volcanic ash, the color of soot. It was loose, shifting, and impossibly heavy. As the troops tried to move inland, they sank, often up to their ankles and knees, slowing the advance to an agonizing crawl. This meant they could not run, and they could not secure a proper footing. Furthermore, the ash choked their weapons. The fine dust worked its way into the mechanisms of the vital M1 Garand rifles and machine guns, reducing their efficiency and, in some cases, turning automatic weapons into single-shot rifles, a catastrophic vulnerability in a firefight. To make matters worse, digging a proper foxhole for cover in the shifting, fine material was almost impossible. The congested, immobilized mass of men and materiel on the flat beach, unable to find cover and struggling with their weapons, was exactly what Kuribayashi had planned for. The Marines were packed into a single, vulnerable target area, observed perfectly from the high, silent slopes of Suribachi. At 10:00 a.m., the silence broke. It was not a wave, but a calculated, sudden detonation from hundreds of concealed apertures, slits in the rock, tiny openings in the terraces of Suribachi. In camouflaged pillboxes, a curtain of pre-sighted fire erupted. Mortars rained down with brutal accuracy, shredding the open beaches. Heavy machine guns swept the exposed troops, cutting down men who could neither advance nor dig for safety. The fire was relentless, crisscrossing, and terrifyingly invisible, seeming to originate from the air itself. The illusion of an easy landing was violently shattered. The ground, so soft and yielding underfoot, was suddenly transformed into a catastrophic killing zone. Casualties mounted instantly and catastrophically, forcing the Marines to fight a battle of survival simply to gain the slightest foothold. The men had landed, but they were trapped. Their heavy equipment was mired in the black ash, their supply lines were choked, and the enemy was safe, deep within the impervious rock. The primary objective became instantly clear: Mount Suribachi, the 550-foot volcano, riddled with bunkers and offering the Japanese perfect, unobstructed observation of the entire beachhead and the northern airfields, had to be silenced. Every minute it remained in Japanese hands. The death toll on the beaches would rise. The battle for Iwo Jima had just begun, and its opening hours were a testament to the cold, merciless attrition General Kuribayashi had so brilliantly foreseen. The Marines faced not just a battle for a patch of ground, but a siege against a hostile living fortress, designed to be fought to the absolute bitter end. The island, barely conquered, had already begun to extract its terrible price. The men of the V Amphibious Corps, trapped on the beachhead, could look up at the towering, silent Suribachi and see only death raining down on them. The initial confusion of the landing gave way to the grim, cold realization that they were fighting a static, perfectly positioned enemy who understood firepower disparity. General Kuribayashi had designed his positions to be mutually supporting, and the fire, when it came, was so intense that it was not merely suppressive, it was designed for catastrophic annihilation. The Marines of the 28th Regimental Combat Team RCT, assigned the suicidal task of taking Suribachi, quickly understood the nature of their mission. It was less a battle than a siege against a vertical fortress. They had to advance directly up the volcano's terraced, heavily mined slopes, a jagged landscape riddled with openings that spat fire. The climb began in the afternoon of February 19th, and instantly the casualties mounted with terrifying speed. Every yard of altitude was purchased with blood, sweat, and the deafening concussion of demolition. The fight on Suribachi established the brutal tactics that would define the entire battle. Conventional shelling was useless against the deep, concrete reinforced bunkers and the extensive cave network. The infantryman's rifle became secondary to specialized, up-close instruments of death. This was the battle where the flamethrower became an indispensable, if psychologically scarring, tool of war. The Marines, often operating in small three-man teams, had to first locate the infinitesimally small, camouflaged firing slits of a pillbox or the mouth of a tunnel. Then, under suppressing fire, the flamethrower operator would advance, a walking target, to drench the opening in napalm. The objective was not merely to burn the occupants, but to consume the oxygen inside the bunker, forcing any survivors deeper into the suffocating network or, ideally, out into the open for capture or elimination. The flamethrower was a necessary evil, yet it came at an immense human cost. The Japanese recognized the flamethrower operator as the single greatest threat to their subterranean strategy, and they prioritized his destruction above all others. Of the 335 flamethrower operators deployed on Iwo Jima, only 18 survived the entire battle. The psychological horror of using such a weapon was matched only by the extreme courage required to wield it, knowing you were instantly marked for death. The advance up Suribachi was a slow, agonizing process of blowtorch and corkscrew. After the flamethrower cleared the entrance, demolition specialists would follow, often crawling under heavy fire to place massive satchel charges, explosive corkscrews directly into the cave or tunnel mouth to seal the Japanese permanently inside, denying them the ability to retreat and fight another day. It was close-quarters murder, committed in the choking smell of sulfur, ash, and burning flesh, demanded by General Kuribayashi's unrelenting attrition strategy, which commanded his men to die only after taking 10 Americans with them. After 4 days of this grinding vertical combat, the 28th Regiment reached the summit. On the morning of February 23, 1945, a small patrol led by Lieutenant Harold Schreier reached the crater rim. They found a length of pipe and, attaching a small American flag to it, hoisted it skyward at approximately 10:20 the effect was instantaneous. A roar, raw and profound, erupted from the thousands of Marines still fighting and dying on the beaches below, and spread across the entire fleet. For the men on the ground, struggling in the ash and mud, that small flag was an emotional lifeline, the first clear signal that the hellish struggle had yielded a tangible success. The naval ships surrounding the island erupted in a chorus of horns and whistles, momentarily drowning out the sound of the war itself. However, the size of the initial flag was deemed too small to be seen clearly across the entire island and by the vast fleet. Soon after, a larger, more prominent flag was procured. A second group of Marines and a Navy corpsman, 6 men in total, hauled a much larger flag up the mountain. As they struggled to erect the heavy pole against the ferocious wind on the summit, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had raced to the top, snapped the shutter. The resulting photograph, Rosenthal's image of the 6 men straining against the sky, was an instant global phenomenon. Published in Sunday newspapers just 2 days later, it became the iconic image of the entire Pacific War, an immediate symbol of American patriotic resolve and ultimate victory. It was instantly seized upon by the American home front, used to sell war bonds, and ultimately became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial. Yet the fame of this magnificent photograph immediately created a profound, enduring myth that obscured the much uglier truth. The image suggested victory, but in reality, the flag raising marked only the end of the beginning. Suribachi was taken, yes, but the island was far from secured. 3 of the 6 men captured in Rosenthal's iconic frame, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, would be killed in action in the gruesome weeks of fighting yet to come. With Suribachi finally silenced, the focus shifted with grim certainty to the northern plateau, where the vast majority of Kuribayashi's army remained intact and untouched. The Marines turned toward the Motoyama Plateau, a slightly higher, flat ground where the 2 vital airfields were located. This was General Kuribayashi's true fortress, a landscape of jagged, rocky ridges, deep ravines, and an even denser network of mutually supporting tunnels than the volcano they had just left. It was here, across the Motoyama Plateau, that the battle transformed into what the Marines grimly named the Meatgrinder, a stretch of volcanic hell anchored by Hills 382 Turkey Knob and the amphitheater. The heroism required to climb Suribachi was immense, but the sustained, grinding valor required to survive the northern plateau would become the ultimate testament to the fighting spirit of the American forces. The price of Iwo Jima was only now being calculated. The euphoria of the flag raising, so desperately needed by the war-weary Marines and the distant American home front, was a fleeting, precious lie. On the southern slopes of Mount Suribachi, the struggle for the volcano itself had been won. But the true battle, the deep, agonizing siege of General Kuribayashi's subterranean fortress lay ahead. The moment the Marine divisions turned northward, shifting their momentum toward the Motoyama Plateau, the symbolic victory yielded to the unromantic, crushing reality of the Meatgrinder. This northern half of Iwo Jima was the commander's final, perfect killing ground. Unlike the relatively smooth slopes of Suribachi, the Motoyama Plateau was a tortured expanse of jagged, rocky ridges, deep, concealing ravines, and hills that appeared unremarkable until they began to erupt with unseen, concentrated fire. Here, Kuribayashi had centralized his main defensive force, transforming the landscape into a densely packed, multi-layered bunker complex anchored by three primary choke points: Hill 382, a height that offered a terrifying vista of the central battlefield; Turkey Knob, a cluster of fortified positions near the east coast, and the open ground between them, known instantly and grimly to the Marines as the amphitheater. This collection of strongholds was designed not merely to resist, but to commit mass, methodical slaughter. The tactical situation was maddening. The Marines, the shock troops of the Pacific, were accustomed to fighting fluid battles of maneuver and overwhelming firepower. Here, all maneuver was denied. Kuribayashi had so expertly connected his 1,500 fortified positions with over 11 miles of tunnels that the Americans were forced to fight the same men for the same piece of ground multiple times. An hour of relentless artillery fire would reduce a pillbox to rubble. The infantry would cautiously advance, only to be met by fire erupting from a second, smaller aperture 50 yards away, or worse, from the now vacant pillbox's entrance as the Japanese troops, having retreated through the tunnel network, re-emerged behind the advancing American line. The subterranean fortress negated almost every American advantage. Naval shells and heavy aerial bombs struck rock and concrete, detonating harmlessly above the deeply entrenched enemy. The ground combat was stripped down to a primal, horrifying simplicity. If you couldn't see the enemy, you couldn't kill him. If you couldn't kill him, you couldn't move. The advance of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions slowed to an agonizing crawl, inches purchased with lives. The objective now was not conquest, but methodical extermination, a systematic process of cleansing an entire underground city. It was in this claustrophobic life-or-death struggle that specialized combat teams became the only currency of success. The blowtorch and corkscrew became the necessary barbaric liturgy of the Northern Campaign. The flamethrower team, typically 2 riflemen covering a single flamethrower operator, became the most essential and the most exposed men on the island. Their job was to advance under withering machine gun fire, often crawling across broken, shell-pocked terrain to deliver a sustained burst of napalm into the camouflaged firing aperture of a pillbox or the mouth of a cave. The fire was effective not just as an incendiary weapon, but as a psychological and chemical agent. It consumed the oxygen inside the enclosed space, forcing the Japanese defenders either to burn, suffocate, or bolt into the open, where they were instantly cut down by the covering infantry. The cost for the operators of these specialized tanks and shoulder-fired units was beyond horrific. General Kuribayashi's troops were explicitly instructed to prioritize the elimination of these teams. They understood that the flamethrower was the only weapon that truly nullified the advantage of their tunnels. Of the 335 flamethrower operators deployed on Iwo Jima, only a mere 18 survived the entire 36-day battle. Their sacrifice was absolute and definitive, a measure of the uncompromising nature of the fighting. As one veteran would later attest, the flamethrower was the only thing that saved lives, because it prevented Marines from having to make the suicidal entry into tunnels that were all booby-trapped and promised certain death. The advance toward Hill 382 was a defining moment of the Meatgrinder. The Marines found themselves facing a maze of concrete strongpoints and mortar pits, all interconnected and concealed. Shelling the hill only served to rearrange the rubble, providing the Japanese with new firing positions. The terrain around Turkey Knob, a prominent elevation, was so heavily contested that the Marine Corps casualties soared to unprecedented levels. The sheer proximity of the fighting, often less than 50 yards from concealed Japanese positions, meant that the constant, intense noise of the battle was deafening, amplified by the sulfurous atmosphere, creating a state of perpetual numbing anxiety. Men fought and slept in the black volcanic ash that now held the remains of their comrades, struggling to distinguish enemy combatants from the shifting shadows and plumes of smoke. Yet, amidst this carnage, a moment of profound validation arrived. On March 4th, barely 2 weeks into the battle, and while the fighting on the Motoyama Plateau was at its most furious, a lone, crippled B-29 superfortress named the Dynamite appeared over the island. Returning from a raid over Japan, heavily damaged and critically low on fuel, its crew was forced to make an emergency landing. Despite intermittent Japanese mortar fire still striking the airfield, the massive bomber successfully touched down on the partially secured runway, the site of that crippled silver giant, an emblem of America's long reach. Landing safely provided an immediate visceral justification for the horror. It was a tangible realization of the island's indispensable strategic value. The Marines, fighting and dying for control of that flat strip of volcanic ash, were visibly reminded of why they were there, not just for territory, but for the lives of the airmen who flew those dangerous missions. This scene, repeated over and over in the subsequent weeks, provided the psychological fuel necessary for the final, agonizing push. The Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions, their numbers dwindling, their faces grimed with ash and exhaustion, pressed forward, knowing that the price for that sanctuary, however high, was ultimately saving the lives of thousands of others. The battle was far from over, but the turning point, rooted in the utter necessity of the flamethrower and the sight of a crippled bomber, had been reached. The island, barely conquered, had already begun to extract its terrible price. The men of the V Amphibious Corps, trapped on the beachhead, could look up at the towering, silent Suribachi and see only death raining down on them. The initial confusion of the landing gave way to the grim but cold realization that they were fighting a static, perfectly positioned enemy who understood firepower disparity. General Kuribayashi had designed his positions to be mutually supporting, and the fire, when it came, was so intense that it was not merely suppressive, it was designed for catastrophic annihilation. The Marines pressed northward into the heart of Kuribayashi's fortress, a nightmare landscape of high ground anchored by the main airfields. This phase of the battle stripped away any lingering romance from the image of the flag, revealing the pure, unsentimental viciousness of the fight. The landscape here, near the Motoyama Plateau, was dominated by 2 monstrous defensive features, Hill 382, and a dense collection of pillboxes and ridges the Marines grimly named Turkey Knob and the Amphitheater. The entire area quickly earned the title the Meatgrinder. General Kuribayashi's brilliance lay in his choice of location and his engineering. This volcanic rock was porous and easily tunneled, allowing his men to create defensive positions of astonishing resilience. The pillboxes, built with thick reinforced concrete, were often connected by deep tunnels to caves that ran 30 to 40 feet below the surface. A Marine company could blast a position, advance over it, and hours later, fire would erupt from the rear as Japanese troops safe during the bombardment used the underground network to reposition and launch devastating counterattacks. The enemy was truly invisible, firing from cunningly disguised apertures that rendered the American numerical and firepower advantage almost moot. The tactical situation was maddening. The Marines, the shock troops of the Pacific, were accustomed to fighting fluid battles of maneuver and overwhelming firepower. Here, all maneuver was denied. Kuribayashi had so expertly connected his 1,500 fortified positions with over 11 miles of tunnels that the Americans were forced to fight the same men, for the same piece of ground, multiple times. An hour of relentless artillery fire would reduce a pillbox to rubble. The infantry would cautiously advance, only to be met by fire erupting from a second, smaller aperture 50 yards away, or worse, from the now vacant pillbox's entrance as the Japanese troops, having retreated through the tunnel network, re-emerged behind the advancing American line. The subterranean fortress negated almost every American advantage. Naval shells and heavy aerial bombs struck rock and concrete, detonating harmlessly above the deeply entrenched enemy. The ground combat was stripped down to a primal, horrifying simplicity if you couldn't see the enemy. You couldn't kill him. If you couldn't kill him, you couldn't move. The advance of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions slowed to an agonizing crawl, inches purchased with lives. The objective now was not conquest, but methodical extermination, a systematic process of cleansing an entire underground city. It was in this claustrophobic life-or-death struggle that specialized combat teams became the only currency of success. The blowtorch and corkscrew became the necessary barbaric liturgy of the Northern Campaign. The flamethrower team, typically 2 riflemen covering a single flamethrower operator, became the most essential and the most exposed men on the island. Their job was to advance under withering machine gun fire, often crawling across broken, shell-pocked terrain to deliver a sustained burst of napalm into the camouflaged firing aperture of a pillbox or the mouth of a cave. The fire was effective not just as an incendiary weapon, but as a psychological and chemical agent. It consumed the oxygen inside the enclosed space, forcing the Japanese defenders either to burn, suffocate, or bolt into the open, where they were instantly cut down by the covering infantry. The cost for the operators of these specialized tanks and shoulder-fired units was beyond horrific. General Kuribayashi's troops were explicitly instructed to prioritize the elimination of these teams. They understood that the flamethrower was the only weapon that truly nullified the advantage of their tunnels. Of the 335 flamethrower operators deployed on Iwo Jima, only a mere 18 survived the entire battle. Their sacrifice was absolute and definitive, a measure of the uncompromising nature of the fighting. As one veteran would later attest, the flamethrower was the only thing that saved lives, because it prevented Marines from having to make the suicidal entry into tunnels that were all booby-trapped and promised certain death. The advance toward Hill 382 was a defining moment of the Meatgrinder. The Marines found themselves facing a maze of concrete strongpoints and mortar pits, all interconnected and concealed. Shelling the hill only served to rearrange the rubble, providing the Japanese with new firing positions. The terrain around Turkey Knob, a prominent elevation, was so heavily contested that the Marine Corps casualties soared to unprecedented levels. The sheer proximity of the fighting, often less than 50 yards from concealed Japanese positions, meant that the constant intense noise of the battle was deafening, amplified by the sulfurous atmosphere, creating a state of perpetual, numbing anxiety. Men fought and slept in the black volcanic ash that now held the remains of their comrades, struggling to distinguish enemy combatants from the shifting shadows and plumes of smoke. Yet, amidst this carnage, a moment of profound validation arrived. On March 4th, barely 2 weeks into the battle, and while the fighting on the Motoyama Plateau was at its most furious, a lone, crippled B-29 superfortress named the Dynamite appeared over the island. Returning from a raid over Japan, heavily damaged and critically low on fuel, its crew was forced to make an emergency landing. Despite intermittent Japanese mortar fire still striking the airfield, the massive bomber successfully touched down on the partially secured runway, the site of that crippled silver giant, an emblem of America's long reach. Landing safely provided an immediate, visceral justification for the horror. It was a tangible realization of the island's indispensable strategic value. The Marines, fighting and dying for control of that flat strip of volcanic ash, were visibly reminded of why they were there, not just for territory, but for the lives of the airmen who flew those dangerous missions. This scene, repeated over and over in the subsequent weeks, provided the psychological fuel necessary for the final, agonizing push. The Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions, their numbers dwindling, their faces grimed with ash and exhaustion, pressed forward, knowing that the price for that sanctuary, however high, was ultimately saving the lives of thousands of others. The battle was far from over, but the turning point, rooted in the utter necessity of the flamethrower and the sight of a crippled bomber, had been reached. The grinding, agonizing campaign across the Motoyama Plateau reached its terrible crescendo in the first 3 weeks of March. The high ground, anchored by Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and the amphitheater remained the most lethal contested ground in the Pacific. These were not mere hills, they were massive and coral and concrete citadels, mutually supporting and impervious to the kind of preparatory fire that might have flattened a position in Europe. The Marines had shattered the concept of the defensive line, but in doing so, they had simply broken the enemy into isolated, unyielding pockets, forcing 100 smaller, more ferocious battles of extermination. The advance of the 3rd and 4th and 5th Marine Divisions had slowed to a near imperceptible crawl, often measured in feet per hour. The terrain itself seemed determined to defeat them. The volcanic ash and coral fragments were laced with the metallic remnants of shrapnel and the heavy smell of sulfur and death, creating a suffocating environment of perpetual anxiety. Men lived in constant proximity to the dead, their own fallen comrades, and the stench of Japanese bodies sealed forever inside the earth, yet they were forced to focus with singular, terrifying intensity on the next 3 feet of ground. The fighting for Hill 382 became the tactical and psychological high point of the northern siege. This hill, a central fortress of Kuribayashi's design, was riddled with tunnels and observation posts, offering the Japanese commander a clear view of the 2 airfields and the surrounding ridges. The Marines were forced to attack it, frontal assault after frontal assault, only to gain a few yards, be pinned down by crossfire from unseen bunkers, and watch as their gains were erased by fierce, tunneled counterattacks launched at night. The sheer resilience of the Japanese defense, backed by thick layers of reinforced concrete, and the discipline instilled by Kuribayashi to resist charging and simply kill, was an existential shock to the American fighting machine. This phase of the battle demanded a new, collective level of courage that went beyond individual acts of heroism. It required systematic, corporate valor, often called uncommon valor by those who witnessed it. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz would later immortalize this courage, saying among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. This was the truth of the Meatgrinder. Extraordinary courage became the mundane, necessary prerequisite for every man who advanced, whether he was a rifleman drawing fire, a corpsman tending to the fallen, or a demolition expert crawling toward a smoking cave entrance. The Marines, often fighting for 48 or 72 hours straight without rest, refined the grim choreography of the siege. Specialized teams, often made up of men who had seen their units reduced to skeletons, would coordinate their attack tanks. Armed with the devastating Zippo flamethrower, would engage the primary entrances, saturating the pillboxes with fire. Following them, infantry squads would use grenades and white phosphorus to suppress any movement, allowing the engineers to rush forward and place immense satchel charges designed to cause rock-shattering concussions and permanently seal the entrances. This process was repeated, pitilessly and methodically, thousands of times. It was a siege measured by the number of caves sealed and the number of bunkers permanently silenced, not by the territory gained. The validation provided by the stream of crippled B-29s landing precariously on the partially secured airfields served as the indispensable psychological anchor. The Marines could hear the cheers of the grateful air crews, men whose lives were saved because of the inches of ground being secured in the sulphurous hills. By the end of the battle, over 2,200 superfortresses would make emergency landings, representing the survival of an estimated 24,000 airmen. This staggering life-saving statistic proved unequivocally that the blood price was being paid for a transcendent purpose. A B-29 pilot, in reflecting on the grim sanctuary, famously captured this sentiment: "Whenever I land on that island, I thank God for them who fought for it." The Marines were not just fighting for a flag, they were fighting for the lives of their fellow servicemen, and by mid-March, with the northern ridges finally crumbling under the weight of fire and the systematic application of napalm and explosives, the Japanese defense was broken structurally, but not spiritually. General Kuribayashi had withdrawn to his final command post, a deep, reinforced bunker in a ravine on the northern coast. His forces were now fragmented into hundreds of tiny, isolated pockets, cut off from all water, food, and communication, fighting until every round was spent. It is in this final, desperate isolation that the general's character is most poignantly revealed, contrasting sharply with the American propaganda that portrayed the enemy as mindless fanatics, cut off from all hope. Kuribayashi penned his final communications, letters that revealed a profound sense of stoic, fatalistic duty and deep personal loss. He wrote to his wife, urging her not to plan for his return and explicitly stating that his death was a certainty, a destiny for any commander-in-chief leading a defense against the American juggernaut. His final orders to his men upheld the standard of ruthless attrition: do not give up, inflict damage, and die with honor. Yet, the final moments of the soldiers themselves, as later revealed in captured letters and recounted in humanized historical accounts, often turned not toward the emperor, but toward family, particularly mothers back home. They were fighting a doomed war, but doing so with a disciplined, fatalistic resolve that was both military doctrine and a deeply personal final expression. The official end of the battle was marked by General Holland Howland Mad Smith's declaration that the island was secured on March 26, 1945, but Kuribayashi had one final characteristic act of defiance. On the night of March 25, 26, recognizing the total annihilation of his force was imminent, he personally led a final desperate counterattack. It was not the large-scale suicidal banzai charge of earlier battles, but a precise final assault launched by approximately 300 remaining men, including his staff and headquarters personnel, who emerged from their final caves to target American rear echelon airmen and support troops near the airfields. The melee was brutal, close quarters, and brief. Kuribayashi himself likely died in this final fighting, though his body was never positively identified, allowing him to achieve the ultimate anonymous sacrifice he had written about to his family. When the final tally was cast, the true horror of the Iwo Jima campaign was laid bare over 26,000 American casualties, including 6,821 dead or missing, the highest casualties suffered by the Marine Corps in a single battle. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken alive. This near-total annihilation, a staggering 99% casualty rate, was the horrifying statistical proof of Kuribayashi's success in fulfilling his mandate of attrition. Iwo Jima was over, but its enduring myth, cemented by the iconic image of the flag raising, stood in stark and painful contrast to the reality of the subterranean fortress and the astronomical cost of its capture. The battle secured the skies for the B-29s, but more significantly, it delivered the final bloody lesson to the Allied command. The defense of the Japanese homeland would be a war of national extinction, a realization that immediately set the stage for the terrifying, unavoidable choice that would conclude the war. The official declaration of the island's securing on March 26, 1945 would be a statistical formality, a bureaucratic endpoint that bore little resemblance to the actual grinding reality of the war's conclusion on Iwo Jima. By the third week of March, the cohesive Japanese defense, orchestrated for months by Kuribayashi, had been shattered. Yet, the Japanese garrison was not defeated. It was merely fragmented, broken down into hundreds of tiny, isolated pockets of absolute fanatical resistance. The Marines, exhausted, their faces grimed with weeks of volcanic ash, blood, and the perpetual stink of sulfur, had to continue the same brutal, systematic extermination they had mastered in the Meatgrinder. The final phase of the battle concentrated on the northernmost tip of the island, particularly around Kitano Point, a landscape even more rugged and broken than the Motoyama Plateau, dominated by deep ravines and coastal caves. Here, General Kuribayashi had established his final command post, a heavily reinforced, deep bunker nestled in a ravine, symbolically positioned at the very edge of the earth. The fighting now was a psychological as much as a physical battle. The American objective was not to seize ground, but to neutralize every final isolated pocket of resistance. The Japanese soldiers, cut off from all food, water, and communication, their ranks thinned to skeletal units, still adhered to their commander's doctrine of maximizing attrition. They were fighting for hours to kill one more American, emerging suddenly from holes the size of dinner plates, throwing grenades, and disappearing back into the labyrinth. The constant close-quarters combat against an unseen, uncompromising enemy began to fray the nerves of the American troops. The engineers and flamethrower teams, the specialists in subterranean warfare, bore the heaviest burden. They were required to confront the enemy face to face, often in the darkness of a claustrophobic cave. This work was a necessary horror, demanding a steeling of the will to seal the entrances with massive demolition charges, knowing full well that they were condemning men to a terrible final death by concussion or suffocation. Yet, as veterans attest, this was the only way to save American lives, as entering those caves booby-trapped and designed for the final ambush was a guaranteed death sentence. The casualty figures, already devastating, continued to climb. The sight of the constant stream of wounded being evacuated to the beachhead and the stark reality of the corpses lined up for burial was a perpetual, grim reminder of the price of every inch of volcanic rock. The total tally of American casualties dead, wounded, and missing had soared past $20,000 and was heading relentlessly toward the 26,000 mark. But even as the final pockets of resistance were being methodically crushed, the profound strategic validation for this monumental sacrifice was manifesting itself in the skies above. Day after day, a stream of silver giants, B-29 superfortresses, returning crippled and battered from missions over Tokyo and Nagoya, limped out of the smoke-filled skies and made emergency landings on the airfields of the Maruyama Plateau, the very strips of land the Marines had died to secure. The scene was often chaotic, and always inspiring ground crews scrambled to meet the incoming bombers, some with engines sputtering and wings shot full of holes, landing under the occasional defiant scatter of Japanese mortar fire that still erupted from the uncleared caves. By the time the battle officially concluded, the runways of Iwo Jima had saved over 2,200 B-29s that otherwise would have been forced to ditch in the freezing, unforgiving Pacific Ocean. Given that each bomber carried a crew of 11 men, this translated into the salvation of an estimated 24,000 airmen. This staggering figure provided the ultimate, unassailable answer to the critics who questioned the astronomical cost of the island. The sacrifice of the 6 to 821 dead Marines and sailors was directly translated into the rescue of nearly 4 times that number of airmen, men who were vital to the continuation of the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The island was a sanctuary, a necessary link in the chain of aerial destruction, purchased with the lives of the Marines. The heartfelt words of a rescued B-29 pilot, who famously said that whenever I land on that island, I thank God for them who fought for it, became the moral currency that justified the blood price. As the military significance solidified, the fate of the Japanese command was sealed. General Kuribayashi, cut off from any central communication and facing the complete annihilation of his force, upheld his stoic, fatalistic commitment to the Japanese code of no surrender. In his final letters to his wife, penned in the cold darkness of his deep command bunker, he expressed an austere resignation. "Do not plan for my return. Do not be surprised when you hear that I have died. A commander-in-chief is never transferred before battle." He maintained his final, terrifying resolve, instructing his men to avoid the ignominy of capture and to continue the attrition until their last breath. In the final hours before the American forces declared the island secured, Kuribayashi executed his last personal act of defiance. Recognizing that his remaining force was doomed, he led a small, desperate counterattack in the early hours of March 26th. This was not the chaotic, massive banzai charge of earlier battles, but a precise final thrust of around 300 men, a final band that included his command staff, who emerged from the darkness near the airfield to strike at American rear echelon personnel, targeting airmen and support troops in a final attempt to inflict pain. The melee was short, vicious, and doomed. General Kuribayashi almost certainly perished in this final, chaotic, hand-to-hand combat, achieving the honorable anonymous death he had preemptively described to his family. His body was never positively identified, a final ghost in the subterranean fortress he had engineered. With the annihilation of the Japanese command on March 26th, the battle officially concluded. The island, secured after 36 days of relentless, barbaric fighting, was a testament to the uncompromising nature of modern siege warfare. The final casualty statistics delivered a terrifying message: 26 Azuro 38 American casualties, including 6 E-821 dead, against nearly 21,000 Japanese dead and only 216 captured. Kuribayashi's attrition strategy had succeeded in one key regard. It made the cost of taking the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, appear so catastrophic as to be politically and morally untenable, thereby setting the stage for the final, terrible chapter of the Pacific War. The official declaration on March 26, 1945, that Iwo Jima was secured was the administrative closure of a 36-day siege, but it was far from the human or strategic finale. The ensuing weeks were spent in the grim, necessary task of counting the dead, treating the thousands of wounded, and clearing the final isolated Japanese stragglers who continued to emerge from the endless, suffocating network of tunnels in the northern ravines. For the men left behind, the psychological strain of these weeks of mopping up was almost as severe as the battle itself, requiring them to constantly fight an invisible enemy who had no hope of victory, only of last-minute sacrifice. When the final casualty ledger was closed, the statistics were profoundly shocking. 26 of Ixio 38 American casualties, a figure that included 6 or 821 dead or missing, the highest casualties suffered by the Marine Corps in a single battle of the war. Against this loss, the Japanese garrison was, by General Kuribayashi's design, almost entirely annihilated, with over 20 to 700 confirmed dead and a mere 216 taken prisoner. The casualty ratio American losses versus the number of Japanese defenders was unprecedented, starkly confirming that Kuribayashi's strategy of attrition had succeeded in inflicting the maximum possible price for a piece of ground barely 8 square miles in size. The controversy was immediate. To the American public, buoyed by the symbolic power of the flag raising, the cost seemed almost unbearable. Why, the public asked, had so many young men died for a desolate sulfuric rock? The answer, however, was already landing on the runways. The continuous stream of crippled B-29 superfortresses, limping toward the newly secured airfields, provided the moral and strategic justification for the monumental sacrifice. Day after day, a B-29 shot up over Tokyo or running on fumes after the long flight would veer out of the sky, its landing gear shaking, making an emergency landing on the Motoyama Plateau. The island, which had been purchased with fire and napalm, had become the indispensable sanctuary the planners had promised. By the war's end, the airfields of Iwo Jima had saved over 2,200 B-29s, translating directly into the survival of an estimated 24,000 airmen who otherwise would have been forced to ditch in the unforgiving Pacific. The gratitude of those airmen was encapsulated by one B-29 pilot, who famously stated that, "Whenever I land on that island, I thank God for them who fought for it." And this number 24, these Unalers' lives saved, became the lasting metric by which the Marine sacrifice was measured and justified. Yet, the strategic reality of Iwo Jima was quickly overshadowed by its most enduring piece of propaganda, the photograph. Joe Rosenthal's image of the 6 men struggling to raise the large flag on Suribachi was an instant global sensation. It was published in Sunday newspapers 2 days after it was taken, reprinted in millions of publications, and immediately won the Pulitzer Prize. It transcended war photography, becoming an immediate universal symbol of uncommon valor and the unflagging patriotic commitment to final victory. The photograph was so powerful, so perfect in its composition and timing, that it immediately crystallized a myth that obscured the brutal truth of the battle. The myth suggested victory was instantaneous and inevitable the moment the flag went up. The reality was that the flag raising marked only the end of the beginning, the vast subterranean fortress of the Motoyama Plateau. The Meatgrinder lay waiting for 32 more days of systematic, agonizing annihilation. Furthermore, the photograph itself was the second flag raised that day, an act of visibility intended to be seen across the island, rather than the initial smaller flag raising that was arguably the more spontaneous, significant moment of military triumph. The myth became a crushing psychological burden for the survivors. 3 of the 6 men immortalized in Rosenthal's frame, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, were killed in the fierce fighting that followed just days after the photo was taken. The surviving flag raisers were pulled from the hell of Iwo Jima and thrust immediately into the dizzying limelight of a hero's welcome back home, where they were forced to tour the country selling war bonds, their faces plastered on billboards and posters. They were celebrated for a victory that was still being paid for, daily, by the lives of their comrades in the sulphurous ridges of the northern island. This contrast, the clean, inspiring image versus the grim, bloody reality of the subterranean siege, was a profound source of lifelong psychological trauma for the men who had to live out the myth. The enduring legacy of Iwo Jima is precisely this juxtaposition of myth and reality. The battle stands as a definitive testament to the effectiveness of Kuribayashi's anti-maneuver, attrition-based defense. By turning the island into an underground fortress, he maximized the American casualty count and shattered the Marine Corps' expectation of a quick, decisive battle. This horrific, uncompromising cost, the fact that nearly 7,000 American lives were lost for a piece of ground 8 square miles wide, was the central lesson the Joint Chiefs of Staff were forced to internalize. Iwo Jima proved that the closer the Allies got to the Japanese homeland, the more fanatical and costly the resistance would be, confirming that the defense of Japan itself, Operation Downfall, would result in an unimaginable catastrophe. The subterranean defense of Kuribayashi, paid for by the lives of Marines, thus became the single most compelling argument for abandoning a traditional invasion and seeking a radical, shocking alternative, a decision that was already taking shape in the highly secret chambers of Washington, D.C., preparing the world for the atomic age. The official end of the battle on March 26, 1945, was a necessary bureaucratic formality, a line drawn on a calendar to satisfy the war machine back home. For the Marines and Navy corpsmen still on Iwo Jima, however, the brutal, unrelenting combat did not cease. The island had been declared secured, but General Kuribayashi's subterranean fortress remained alive, its fragments refusing to acknowledge their defeat. The Japanese, cut off, starving, and often wounded, continued to emerge from the endless, suffocating network of tunnels in the northern ravines, fighting with a suicidal intensity that spoke not of strategy, but of absolute fatalistic commitment to a warrior code. The engineers, the infantry, and the heavy equipment were now engaged in the grim final task of accounting a methodical, pitiless extermination of an army that would not surrender. This mopping up was perhaps the most psychologically scarring phase of the entire siege. The enemy was no longer an organized force, but an anonymous ghost emerging from a hole the size of a grenade aperture, firing a burst, and disappearing back into the darkness. To the exhausted, battle-weary Americans, the distinction between military engagement and cold-blooded annihilation became horrifyingly thin. They were forced to maintain a constant, paranoid vigilance, knowing that a single hidden soldier could take 3 or 4 lives before he was finally eliminated. The only language the tunnels understood was fire and concussion. The flamethrower and the satchel charge remained the indispensable tools, their necessity a constant, terrible reminder that surrender was never an option for the enemy. Amidst the sulphurous stench and the unending tension of these final skirmishes, the ultimate reckoning of the battle's cost began to take shape. The final casualty statistics, once tallied, were a statistical and moral thunderclap: 26 of 38 American casualties, including 6,821 dead or missing, the highest casualties suffered by the Marine Corps in its history. Against this, the Japanese garrison was, by design, utterly annihilated, with only 216 out of over 20,000 men taken prisoner. This near-total elimination, a 99% casualty rate for the defenders, was the undeniable proof of Kuribayashi's success in fulfilling his mandate. He could not save the island, but he had extracted an astronomical price in American blood. This ghastly ledger immediately fueled the intense, lingering debate back home. Was this desolate 8-square-mile rock truly worth such a price? Why had so many young Americans died for a piece of ground that was not even the Japanese mainland? The answer, profound and life-affirming, was already visible in the smoky skies over the Motoyama Plateau. The very airfields the Marines had purchased with their lives, Motoyama, 1, 2, and 3, were being put to their intended life-saving purpose. Day after day, a stream of silver giants, the B-29 superfortresses battered and limping, descended from the sky. These bombers were returning from the long, treacherous raids over the Japanese homeland, their fuel tanks critically low, their fuselages riddled with flak, and their crews exhausted. The sight of a crippled B-29 landing precariously on the volcanic ash runways was the most powerful form of justification the Marines could have received. Each bomber carried a crew of 11 men. Without Iwo Jima, these men would have faced the certain doom of ditching in the freezing, unforgiving Pacific, where rescue was improbable and deadly. The Marines, the air crews, and the Navy Seabees who had worked tirelessly, often under direct fire, to repair the airfields all understood the magnitude of this exchange. By the time the war concluded, over 200 B-29s had made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. This single statistic translates into the salvation of an estimated 24,000 airmen, a number nearly 4 times greater than the Marine dead, the words of a grateful B-29 pilot, who famously said that, "Whenever I land on that island, I thank God for them who fought for it," became the moral currency of the island. The sacrifice of the Marines was not for ground alone, but for the collective survival of the thousands of American airmen flying the long war. The island was a sanctuary, an essential staging area for rescue, purchased with fire and bone, yet, even as the strategic value solidified, the national memory became irrevocably tied to the transcendent myth of the flag raising. Joe Rosenthal's photograph, taken atop Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, was arguably the most significant piece of propaganda of the war. It was an image of pure, heroic struggle, instantly capturing the nation's patriotic spirit and unflagging commitment to final victory. It was published across millions of newspapers, became the model for the iconic Marine Corps War Memorial, and was immediately used to launch a massive, highly successful war bond campaign. But this powerful myth obscured the profound and painful reality. The image represented a fleeting moment just 4 days into a 36-day siege. The vast, bloody fortress of the Motoyama Plateau, the true Meatgrinder, lay waiting below the summit. Furthermore, the photograph created a crushing psychological trauma for the survivors it depicted. 3 of the 6 men immortalized in the image, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, were killed in action in the gruesome weeks of fighting that followed the flag raising. The 3 surviving flag raisers, Ira Hayes, Harold Schultz, and Harold Keller, were pulled from the hell of Iwo Jima and thrust immediately into the blinding, dizzying limelight of a national war bond tour. They were celebrated as living symbols of courage, their faces plastered on billboards and posters, forced to smile and rally the nation for a victory that was still being paid for in blood on the distant volcanic shores. The disconnect between the heroic, clean image and the grim, sensory reality they had just escaped, the constant terror, the mud, the stench, and the loss of their comrades, was a profound source of lifelong psychological distress and suffering. The myth was necessary for the nation, but it was a curse for the men who had to embody it. Ultimately, the most lasting strategic consequence of Iwo Jima lay not in the saving of airmen, nor in the power of its imagery, but in the terrifying, unassailable lesson its casualty list delivered to the Allied High Command. General Kuribayashi's systematic attrition-based defense had convinced the American leadership that the defense of the Japanese homeland operation downfall would not merely be costly, it would be catastrophic. The price paid for 8 square miles of rock proved that an invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, where the Japanese military was prepared to mobilize every man, woman, and child for a national suicide, would result in casualties running into the millions. This grim, calculated understanding born from the black ash and subterranean fighting of Iwo Jima was the final terrible piece of evidence that tipped the strategic scales. It made the decision to use the atomic bomb, then being finalized at the Potsdam Conference, appear to the war-weary American leadership as the most viable, tragic, and necessary alternative to a protracted genocidal ground invasion. The island, conquered at immense human cost, had inadvertently become the sacrificial altar upon which the terrible calculus of the nuclear age was confirmed. The Battle of Iwo Jima, immortalized by a moment of hope, stands as the enduring monument to the unyielding reality of war and the final agonizing decision that ended it. As Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz so eloquently declared, the valor displayed there was indeed common, but its consequences were anything but